Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Dmitri Alperovitch. He is the author of the new book, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Why don't you start by telling us why you wrote the book? What was your goal?
Well, I started writing the book right after the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, and I was one of the first geopolitical analysts to have predicted that invasion months before it occurred. And as I was looking at the impact of that war and the causes of it, I was very concerned that the same dynamics were playing out in the other part of the world, namely in the Taiwan Strait, and that we were on a path to another conflict that would be much more devastating than the war in Ukraine. And luckily with this one, we still have time to try to prevent it, to try to deter it, which we didn't with Ukraine. And that was really the attempt to write this book, to raise the alarm bells about this coming war that we can hopefully prevent.
And explain why Taiwan matters.
So a lot of people have a very simplistic view of Taiwan, that it is this powerhouse of chip manufacturing, which is certainly the case. And it's certainly true that our digital economy is completely reliant on chips. Taiwan manufactures about 90% of the advanced chips, but even more importantly, about 40% of the so-called foundational chips, which are in everything from your cars to microwaves to your computers. But beyond chips, Taiwan has always mattered to the United States. In fact, in 1950, General Douglas MacArthur had called Formosa, as the island was called at the time, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, before the dawn of the age of computing. Taiwan is really at the anchor point of that first island chain that keeps China contained within the Pacific. So if China looks out at the world, they see it themselves essentially completely surrounded by U.S. naval bases, aviational bases from the South Korea in the Korean Peninsula to Japanese islands, and now the Philippines, where we're once again, for the first time in 30 years, establishing bases. And Taiwan really sits at the cornerstone of the first island chain. So if China is able to take Taiwan, it will be able to kick the U.S. out of the Asia-Pacific and dominate that region.
Your book starts with a hypothetical attack on Taiwan, November 2028. This is how that chapter ends. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence had also long warned that Chinese cyber attacks would almost certainly be launched against America's energy and transportation infrastructure. This was a conflict that would be felt in every corner of the U.S. economy. And then there was the risk of a nuclear exchange, and the probability of which was hard to estimate but couldn't be dismissed. This was no limited conflict like Iraq or Afghanistan, or even a large-scale war like Vietnam or Korea. No, the National Security Advisor thought this would be the president and America decide to defend Taiwan. War with China would be unlike anything the country had experienced since World War II. How do we avoid that from happening?
So the key thing is twofold. First of all, I believe that we're in a Cold War with China, and that Cold War actually has remarkable similarities to the first Cold War. We're in a global competition for supremacy around the world, with the diplomatic sphere, economic sphere, military sphere all being impacted. We have an arms race going on, a conventional one and a nuclear one. In fact, China right now is trying to build up massively its nuclear arsenal, going from about 300 warheads to over 1,000 by the end of the decade, as projected by the U.S. intelligence community. We have an economic war. We have a spy war that actually eclipses anything we had seen in the first Cold War. And most importantly, we have this regional flashpoint of Taiwan that is very similar to what West Berlin was to us in the 1950s and 1960s. And we almost went to war with the Soviet Union to prevent them from invading West Berlin. But the key thing is twofold to winning this Cold War. One is to deter the invasion of Taiwan, just like we managed to deter the invasion of West Berlin in the first Cold War, through both military strength and increasing our economic leverage over China. So I'm not for decoupling. In fact, I think that decoupling is impossible with China. It is simply too big. And actually, decoupling is counterproductive because you have no leverage over them, of course, if you decouple. But what we need to do is engage in what I call in the book unidirectional entanglement. Effectively, this asymmetry of dependence where China becomes more dependent on us and we're becoming less dependent on them. So, for example, in the areas of chips, semiconductors, we want to make sure that China is not producing their own chips, but they're buying chips from us, from Taiwan, from Korea, and other places where they're being manufactured. In the area of critical minerals, like rare earths, for example, or lithium, nickel, cobalt, the things that we need to build green energy and many other components for our digital economy, We want to make sure that we're processing those elements in friendly countries as opposed to relying on China, where 90% of the stuff gets processed today.
We are talking with Dmitri Alperovitch, a national security expert and also a cybersecurity expert. If you have a question for him, you can start calling in now. The lines are Democrat 202-748-8000, Republican 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. And you were just talking about decoupling. Let's talk about strategic ambiguity. What is the U.S. role when it comes to those two countries?
So, of course, we have this one China policy, which a lot of people misunderstand, and the Chinese are actively trying to promote disinformation about. It is not a recognition that Taiwan is a part of China. It simply acknowledges the position of the Chinese people that Taiwan belongs to them, but does not agree with it. And in fact, the U.S. position for the last 45 years, since 1979, when we withdrew recognition of Taiwan, has been one of the status quo, that we're not recognizing Taiwan's independence, but we're allowing it to function effectively as its own state, where we have informal relations, and we are against any forceful unification with China. And that's something that is ingrained in our Taiwan Relations Act that was passed in 1979 that demands that the president provide military aid to Taiwan in the form of military sales to make sure that it is not going to be able to be occupied by China.
So how has the current administration and previous administrations walked that line?
So it's been interesting because President Biden has now said on 4 occasions, when asked directly by the press if he would defend Taiwan, he said yes, which of course is not the policy of the United States. And every time he says yes, White House walks it back, saying that we still are abiding by our one China policy. But you know, if it was once or twice, you could think that that was a mistake. 4 times seems intentional. And the reality is that it's actually an interesting way to send a signal both to the Taiwanese of our support and the broader region, and to China that they will face a dilemma of potentially fighting the United States should they move on Taiwan without actually changing the policy.
How would you define our current relationships with both China and Taiwan?
Well, with China, I think we're in a Cold War. And in fact, the sooner we realize it, the better off we are. Look, admitting you have a problem is the first step in the 12-step program. There are 11 other steps, but it's the most crucial one. And until we do that, we are not going to be able to prioritize the key decisions we need to make in this competition. And by saying that this is a strategic competition where we want to compete in some areas and we want to cooperate in others, it makes it very difficult for us to prioritize which one wins over, the competition or the cooperation. And the most important point is that you don't actually have a willing partner in China. In fact, China, on a whole slew of issues, whether it's climate change or fentanyl or Russia-Ukraine conflict, have not been willing to help us at all, and have been demanding to be paid for any cooperation that they might offer on any of these issues. And that's not a path to a productive relationship.
You talked about a little bit the One China policy and then also the Taiwan Relations Act. Let's go back to that really quick, because there's also some confusion over what that says. So what does it say and what does it not say about U.S.'s role in helping to defend Taiwan if it were to be attacked?
Yeah, so we do not have a legal or a policy commitment to defend Taiwan. That's something that will be decided by the president should that conflict arise. But we do have a policy of helping Taiwan militarily in terms of providing military arms to them to make sure that they cannot be occupied by China. And we have been doing that since 1979, since we left our actual troops that had been on Taiwan till that point.
You talk in the book about weapon sales to Taiwan. We have sold them about $30 billion worth of weapons. You talk about how many of them have not been delivered. But how does our weapon sale to them impact the U.S.'s One China policy? Again, how are we walking that line?
Well, this has been our policy to sell them weapons since 1979, so it actually is in full alignment with the One China policy because, again, One China policy does not mean that we recognize that China owns Taiwan. It's simply for the preservation of the status quo, and we believe and have believed for the last 45 years that the best way to prevent the status quo is by making sure that Taiwan remains strong and is able to defend itself.
How does China feel about the weapon sales?
Oh, it's always opposed them, and obviously it wants the weaker Taiwans to make it easier for them to force the unification.
Let's go to the phones. We will talk first with Lee in Miami, Florida. He is calling on the independent line. Good morning, Lee.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for taking my call. The question that I have is one of economics. Right now, so much of what we purchase, what consumers purchase, is manufactured in China. Electronic equipment, all types of things, household goods, clothing, and so forth. How do we get out of that rut, which seems to actually be benefiting consumers because it makes things more cost-effective, and start manufacturing more in the United States without adversely affecting the consumer, whereby things would just be much more expensive?
That's a great question. Well, I think that you can, as I mentioned, fully decouple from China. The number one import from China that we have by value is actually toys. Now, as much as it would be nice to manufacture toys in the United States, it's not necessarily a critical good, and if it continues to be manufactured in China, or if apparel continues to be manufactured in China, that's fine. That doesn't impact our national security. When it comes to other things like critical minerals that go into our weapon systems, like semiconductors, we do want to make sure we have independence. It doesn't necessarily mean everything has to be onshored. Of course, we would like jobs here. But not everything will be economical here. But as long as it's friend-shored, as long as it's going to Mexico, as long as it's going to Indonesia, Malaysia, even Vietnam, that's better for us than it is if it's coming from China.
Let's hear from Jane in Louisiana. She's calling on the Democrats line. Good morning, Jane.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I think earlier one of my questions was already answered. It has something to do with the one China policy. Why hasn't this been updated, considering the importance of Taiwan? And since we've got so many troops in Philippines, Japan, Korea, why did we take the troops out of Taiwan?
So this was a key decision point by President Carter and his National Security Advisor Brzezinski in 1979 to undo the recognition of Taiwan. For the first 2 decades of China's existence, we recognized China as being Taiwan, as it's called, Republic of China, not the mainland China. In 1979, it was reversed, and we pulled troops out of Taiwan and opened up the relationship with China. I don't think that it's a good idea to undo it and to, first of all, that would be a red line for China and may actually trigger a war. So I think the policy of strategic ambiguity should hold, but we should make sure that the status quo, that China is not able to force unification of Taiwan, is going to be preserved. And I have to tell you that unless they go by force, there's no way that they're going to take this island. No one on Taiwan is really supportive of unification. The latest polls show that about 7% of the public wants unification with China. And it's not even clear of those 7% what they actually mean by unification, because for the longest time, of course, on Taiwan, they wanted unification, but by unification, they meant that they would take over the mainland themselves. So there's just no support for that.
Let's hear from Kevin in Oregon, Wisconsin, calling on the Republican line. Good morning, Kevin.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for taking my call. Dmitri, I wanted to table the idea of an industrial policy for the United States. Certainly China has had an industrial policy for a number of decades to promote their competitiveness, to promote their strength in their companies across a number of sectors. Does the U.S. have a plan, or, unless I've missed it, a policy to address or counter the Chinese industrial policy? Thank you.
It's a great question. So we are beginning to resume our industrial policy that we've had during the first Cold War. We forget now, but semiconductors was industrial policy because much of the early customers were the defense industrial base and our space program back in the 1950s and 60s. The GPS, Global Positioning System, was built with U.S. taxpayer dollars. So we've done industrial policy in the past. We're starting to do it again, particularly in the area of semiconductors. We passed the Chips and Science Act that provides about $75 billion of tax credits and direct grants to industry. We'll see how that plays out. And if it fails, I think that will be the end of the industrial policy for quite some time. So we have to make sure we get it right.
Last week, President Biden announced a series of tariffs on Chinese products, aluminum, steel, electric vehicles. How does that factor in?
That's really important. So I believe that to win this Cold War with China, we have to win the competition in 4 critical technology areas. They are AI and autonomy. They are biotech and synthetic biology, the manufacturing of new materials using biological chemistry, space technology, and green technology as we transition to solar, wind, nuclear, and electric vehicles and the like. We want to make sure that we're not dependent on China for the critical energy supply. And right now, we're winning in the first 3. We're losing badly in the last. Chinese electric vehicles are cheaper and, frankly, better than most others out there. They are the leading manufacturer in batteries, leading manufacturer in wind and solar. Much of it has been because of their subsidies and their ability to engage in dumping across the world, but also in their theft of intellectual property. I've spent the last 15 years of my career in cybersecurity space combating Chinese espionage across all of those sectors and many more. So they've stolen a lot of this intellectual property. They've also innovated because it helps you to steal. It helps you to innovate if you steal. And the tariffs are really important to try to even the playing field, to try to encourage domestic production, domestic innovation in this area, because if the Chinese continue to dump on our markets, we will never succeed.
When it comes to things like semiconductors and those components, steel and aluminum, things like that, where are we in terms of reliance on China? How much are we getting from them?
So semiconductors is really interesting. We've managed to basically significantly diminish China's ability to produce advanced semiconductors by preventing export of equipment that you need to manufacture semiconductors. There are 3 countries that manufacture this really advanced equipment, some of the most advanced equipment the world has ever seen. Those countries are the United States, the Netherlands, and Japan. And we've basically been able to bring a coalition of them together to prevent the selling of so-called advanced chips that are basically 18 nanometers or below in size. However, we've not stopped the sale of equipment that you need for manufacturing of the foundational chips, which are actually, I argue, more important than even advanced. Because if you think about even your phone, that phone has about 160, 170 chips inside of it. Only 3 of those chips are advanced: the processor, the memory, and the modem to connect to the cell tower. But everything else that controls the camera, the GPS, the Wi-Fi, the power, the battery, those are all foundational chips. And right now, China is trying to accelerate their path to producing those chips and to dump them on our markets and to try to drive everyone else out of existence, which has been their playbook in solar and wind and nuclear, across all of these numerous sectors, batteries, and it's been 100% successful for them. So we absolutely need tariffs in these industries to prevent that dumping and to try to sustain our own industries.
As you mentioned, you were one of the first national security experts to predict Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From your book, this quote: "One might think that Russia's disastrous failure to conquer Ukraine and the wide-ranging consequences of the economic and diplomatic isolation from the West it had suffered as a result would give President Xi some pause in attempting his own military adventure. While that is possible, we can't rely on such wishful thinking alone. For one, the Chinese have an arrogant attitude towards Russia and its capabilities in nearly every area: economic power, domestic political control, the mastering of advanced technologies, global diplomatic clout, the proliferation of domestic titans of industry. China has long ago bypassed the Russian Federation. It's not a stretch to imagine that Xi looks at Putin's failures in Ukraine and, rather than seeing lessons for caution, simply assumes that he and his own reformed military would do much better. That where Russia is weak and easily bullied by the West, China is too strong and powerful to be confronted in the same way." So if China, or maybe when China, were to go after Taiwan, how could that look? And how would it be potentially similar to what happened in Ukraine?
So I believe that the causes of 2 conflicts are very similar. Both men are driven by their own distorted view of history. Putin, of course, believed that Ukraine was not a country, that it always belonged to the Russian Empire, erroneously. She believes the same about Taiwan, that Taiwan is not a country, that it belongs to China. Also erroneously, as I write in the book, Taiwan has never actually belonged to China in the full sense of the word, because no one that fully controlled China ever fully controlled Taiwan, not for a moment, throughout history. They believe it's their destiny, their personal destiny and their country's destiny to take these regions. And they believe in the importance of those regions from a security and geographic perspective. Ukraine has often been a pathway to invasion of Russia, whether it's Napoleon or Teutonic Knights or even Hitler in 1939, in 1941. And for Taiwan, as I mentioned, it is a critical point of containment of China. But most importantly, those men are driven by egos, that they didn't just want to take those countries, they wanted to take them under their own watch. They wanted to get credit for that. Putin sees himself as the new Peter the Great that wants to go down in the history books as the great leader that unified these so-called Russian lands. She wants to be the one that goes down in the Chinese history books as someone who's greater than Mao. And that's why I believe that for Taiwan, the most dangerous period is likely 2028 through 2032. Why that period? Well, she's going to be up for re-election within the Chinese Communist Party in 2027, very likely to win it, as he's basically consolidated fully his control over his power. And once he does that and gets past sort of that election in late 2027, his hand basically gets freed in 2028. And in 2032, he's going to be 79. He's going to be up for another election. In their system, they don't tend to elect their people in their 1980s, into their 80s, and he nevertheless may be looking at the twilight of his own life. So if he wants to accomplish it under his own control of the Chinese system, that's probably the time frame to do so. Now, how it might unfold, as you mentioned in the prologue of the book, we write about this fictional but I think very realistic scenario of how this invasion might take place. And a lot of people have this, I think, distorted view that an invasion of Taiwan would sort of be a repeat of Normandy, sort of these Higgins-type landing boats landing on the shores and sort of Saving Private Ryan, Chinese edition. And that's just not the reality of the terrain. In fact, Taiwan is truly a natural fortress of an island. This would be one of the most complicated military operations ever to be conducted in history. And I believe that the only way to succeed for the Chinese is to take major infrastructure through an airborne, heliborne assaults, particularly the port of Taipei, that the Taiwanese unfortunately just built in 2012. So, 12 years ago it did not exist. And that port faces China and has significant capability and capacity to offload massive amounts of troops that you would then let out on the highways around Taiwan to capture the key population bases. But also, right next to the port is the opening to the Tamsui River that leads straight into the city. So if you use these high-powered so-called LCAC boats with high-powered fans at the end of them, you can, within 15 minutes, offload a battalion of Marines, Chinese Marines, into the heart of the city of Taipei, the capital, and capture or try to capture the key government installations, particularly the Presidential Palace and Ministry of National Defense, and try to decapitate the government. So this one-two punch of being able to capture the port, to offload huge numbers of forces, armored vehicles, tanks, logistics, to capture this island of 23 million people, plus the assault via these LCAC boats down the river, and potentially an attempt to capture the city airport, then the international airport on Taiwan to bring in heavy transport planes into the country. That's probably the most likely way that China would go about capturing this island.
And in the forward, this scenario that you put into 2028, it's not just President Putin and President Xi's timeline, but you also talk about distractions, that we are maybe not paying enough attention to what's happening right now. So what are some of those distractions, and are we paying enough attention?
Well, we are trying to do it all. Look, when it comes to our military, we still have the strongest military in the world. The Chinese don't even come close to our capabilities, but of course, that's a spreadsheet-based analysis, and spreadsheets don't go to war, as is often said. And the reality is that in their backyard, in the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese are close to achieving parity with us, which is not the same thing as having the world's greatest military, because if we were to, say, fight China in the Atlantic Ocean or in the, in Latin America or Africa, we would beat them handily. It wouldn't even be close. But that's not the reality of the threat that we're facing. And what we need to do is to make sure that we focus and prioritize avoiding this conflict, deterring this conflict that I would believe, if we don't deter, could either result in a catastrophic war or a decline of American power and the end of the American century. So we have to do everything in our power to make sure that we focus on this first and foremost, That does not mean not do anything else around the world. That does not mean we don't support Ukraine. Does not mean we don't try to tackle the problem that Iran faces in the Middle East. But it means that we prioritize this conflict above all else, and we look at this new Cold War in the same way that we looked at the first one, which is that everything that we do around the world is going to be looked at through that lens. Does it hurt our ability to confront China and to contain them, or does it help it?
This question coming in from X, from Steve. He asks, what is the best possible outcome for Ukraine? Is China paying attention to our resolve in Ukraine? And will it affect the future of Taiwan?
So with regards to affecting the future of Taiwan, I don't believe that the two conflicts are linked. Look, she's going to decide to go against Taiwan based on his own assessment of his capabilities and the capabilities he would face, whether it's the Taiwanese, our own Australians, the Japanese that would be likely to fight with us. What happens halfway around the world in a land war in Europe, I don't think is going to affect his calculus a whole lot. But look, when it comes to Ukraine, unfortunately, they're not in a good position. They've been fighting this war of attrition. Really, it's become a war of attrition since April of 2022, since they won the Battle of Kiev. And now it's about who's going to hold out the longest and whose will is going to break. I don't think the Russians have significant offensive capabilities to advance much further unless we stop supporting Ukraine and the Europeans and ourselves stop providing them with ammunition. Then it is likely that Ukraine will fall. But if that doesn't happen, then this conflict can unfortunately last a long time. In some ways, it's already been going on for 10 years, not since 2022, but really since 2014, when Putin captured Crimea and started this war in the Donbass. Unfortunately, it may go on for another 10.
And another question on X from MLB. He asked, what would you say is the most significant economic policy for future markets we should be pursuing?
So I believe we need to invest in our own innovation, in helping our industry in the semiconductor space and the biotech space and green energy, both in terms of encouraging investments, but also in defending it against Chinese IP theft, particularly in the cyber domain, and also against their overcapacity and dumping on our markets. And we have to punish Chinese companies that have benefited from this intellectual property for the last 20 years. I'd called it back in 2011 the world's greatest theft of intellectual property, the world's greatest transfer of wealth in history. And we have to make sure that the companies that have benefited from that are sanctioned by the U.S. government and that they're not able to reap the benefits of that theft.
And we talked about them both, President Putin and President Xi. President Putin was in China this week. What does China's relationship with Russia, how does it factor into what we're seeing and what eventually could play out?
Yeah, I believe this is very misunderstood. A lot of people talk about Russia and China being allies. They're not allies in any sense of the word. In fact, China is largely not supporting Russia in this war. It is not providing them with military equipment, and to the extent that it is selling them dual-use technologies, it is doing so from a transactional perspective, that it benefits from it, and is able to buy Russian oil and gas on the cheap as well. So it is remarkable to see this summit between Putin and Xi, because Putin had brought his virtually entire cabinet and a whole slew of oligarchs with him to China. And when they announced the official communique, the results of the summit, number one item on the agenda was the reinforcement of the friendship. Empty words. And number two item on the agenda between Russia and China was the establishment of a zone to protect tigers and leopards that both countries have. Now, I'm all for protecting tigers and leopards, but I hardly believe that it is the most important issue in the Russia-China relationship. So it goes to show you that Putin, I think, came in with huge expectations and got potentially very little. Now, we don't know what was done in secret, and there's potentially other communiques that are not being made public, but the fact that even publicly he can't claim much credit on the economic front, or one of the things he really wanted is this new pipeline, gas pipeline called Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, to supply gas that he can no longer sell to Europe, to China. The Chinese have been resisting that for all this time, so he couldn't even announce that as a win.
This question coming in from text, it is from Joseph, Fayetteville, North Carolina. He says, what is Red China's goal? Do they really want control of the nations of the world, or do they just want untold wealth?
So I think they want to be the world's greatest superpower. In fact, I don't think that. I know that. That's been their objective since day one. They've been the world's greatest superpower for much of human history. For much of human history, they were the most populous country, the most powerful, the richest. And it was only in the last few hundred years that we see the Europeans and then later the Americans surpass them because of the Industrial Revolution. So they see that as them reemerging, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, as she calls it, and assuming their rightful place as the world's greatest superpower. That's not a world that I want to live in, because China as the world's greatest superpower means American decline, less prosperity for us, an impact, a huge impact to our national security, and something that I think we should fight at all costs.
Let's hear from Oliver in Philadelphia. He's calling on the independent line. Hi, Oliver.
Morning. The United States made a big mistake years ago trying to save money by closing two big bases that we had in the Philippines, Clark Air Force Base and Subic Naval Base. And I mean, we had the troops right there, but they closed the bases. And getting back to Ukraine, hasn't Putin called up 1.2 million recruits recently? Thank you.
Yeah, on the Philippines, we didn't have much choice because the Philippines were asking for us to leave, of course, after the end of the Cold War. But the most important thing is that we're back now, and they're allowing us to use a number of bases once again, particularly on the Luzon Peninsula facing the Taiwan Strait, a very strategic point for us. So better late than never, but those bases would be extremely important to us should a conflict arise, and more importantly, in deterring conflict. Which is what we want to do. With regards to Russia, so Russia calls up conscripts to its military every year. This is something that is not unusual. Most of those conscripts are not being sent to fight to Ukraine. Some of them are, but for the most part, they stay in Russia. So far, Russians have been able to successfully mobilize voluntarily about 30,000 men every single month because they're able to recruit them from low-income villages around the country, particularly minorities, where they're able to provide them with a lot of money and significant death benefits should they pass. And in many of these places, you don't have much of a choice economically. There's not a lot of jobs available. So joining the military, even at a risk of dying, is still a better proposition for many of these men.
Let's hear from Kino in Lakeland, Florida, calling on the independent line. Hi, Kino.
Yes, good morning, and thanks, C-SPAN, for considering this issue very important. Last year, I read a book called The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan, which I hope C-SPAN will have as a guest at some point. But in that, he talks about the population, the consequences of the 30-year policy in China of the one-child policy, that now there's going to come a turning point where the population will start to decline. There will be more old people to take care of than there's enough young people to take care of. And so I want to ask the author, has he addressed this in his book? And if he did not, would he address it now? And what about this population decline, that China is going to go into decline, and they don't even have enough people to recruit into their military now, and so on? How is that going to affect the United States relationships with China?
No, that's a great point. So I do talk about demographics in the book. The decline has actually already begun. In the last few years, they've been losing population steadily, so their birth rate is below that of replacement. However, this is a long-term fuse that's been lit. So you're not seeing much of an economic impact from that demographics decline, because they still have a huge number of rural population men and women that are migrating into the cities and contributing to productivity growth. But you're going to see that taper off in the 30s and 40s. So in a few decades, you're going to see the real impact, economic impact of that demographic decline. But we should not overestimate its importance. So look, it's projected fairly conservatively that China would go from about 1.4 billion people that they have today to about 550 million by the end of the century. That's still larger than 330 million that we have today. So the idea that they would have no people for their military is just not the case, right? Russia has been in a demographics decline for the last 30 years. They're still able to mobilize men to fight a war in Ukraine. So while I agree that demographics are really important for the long-term economic prospects for China and its decline, it is not necessarily going to make them less of a threat based on population numbers alone.
Let's hear from Rick in Carterville, New York. He's calling on the Democrats line. Hi, Rick.
Hi. Thanks to C-SPAN. Love your show, and it's a blessing to our country. I'd like to ask your guest with the our House GOP being in love with Russia as much as it is, fighting against Ukraine supplies and providing them support. How much does China benefit from the GOP policies?
Well, I think that China has actually been the one bipartisan issue in this town. When you look at the legislation that we've been able to pass, like the Chips and Science Act and even the current aid package that was just passed to Ukraine, much of it was able to garner votes from both sides because of its anti-China position. With CHIPS, it was very much labeled as a way to catch up to China and prevent them from dominating the sector. With the aid package, not only was there $61 billion for Ukraine, but there were billions of dollars for Taiwan and many more billions of dollars for the U.S. military in our own buildup in the Indo-Pacific to confront China. So I think that if there is one commonality between the two parties right now, it is on China policy, because I think inherently both sides appreciate that we are truly in a Cold War, even if many are not willing to say so, and we need to make sure we win it.
You are a national security expert and also a cybersecurity expert. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you're working on now.
So I've been focused on cybersecurity for a good chunk of my career. I founded a very successful cybersecurity company, which we took public. And I've been spending really the last 15 years of my life in the cyber arena battling China. Back in 2010, it was a big change for me personally because I led an investigation that ended up being called Operation Aurora, which was the hack of Google by China. The first time that the public really broadly realized that China was hacking into companies all over this country, stealing their intellectual property, stealing their trade secrets for the benefit of their domestic industry. And in the last 4 years, really have been focused on the broader national security challenges, whether it's Russia or China, and doing a lot of work in Ukraine to help them with their strategy vis-a-vis Russia, but a lot of my time being spent now on the Chinese issues. And I have a think tank called Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit think tank that's focused on this.
And with that background, I want to get your opinion on this. The story out in the Wall Street Journal this morning: U.S. fears undersea cables are vulnerable to espionage from Chinese repair ships. It seems like everything is vulnerable these days. How do we prepare against these hacks and potential threats from China?
Well, look, the reality is that we are very vulnerable. We're not going to stop every attack. We have to focus on resiliency. We have to make sure that as the Chinese are infiltrating our networks, and right now the U.S. government talks about this threat that they call Volt Typhoon, which is affiliated with the Chinese government, that's doing something very different from what they've traditionally done. Traditionally, they've hacked into these private companies, private networks, and basically stole their data to help their domestic industry. Now they're hacking into companies and organizations that have no valuable data to steal. It's small water utilities or electric utilities, particularly in the region or in the western coast of the United States, or port facilities, where you're not focused on espionage, you're focused on pre-positioning for potential disruption or destruction in the event of conflict. And that's an entirely different threat, and we have to make sure that we are much more resilient to these attacks, both in cyber domain and outside of cyber. So one way, for example, that you can be more resilient in the water sector is not just focus on shoring up your networks against these types of threats, but also make sure you have plenty of bottled water in case that there is disruptions, at least temporary disruptions in supply, that you have generators if there's disruptions with electricity. So focusing on that resiliency helps across a wide range of threats, both man-made and natural disasters, of course, and we have to do more in that space.
And along those same lines, we are heading into the 2024 presidential election, and there's a lot of talk of AI and deep fakes. What impact could those have on the election? Are we ready?
Yeah, I'm not an alarmist on this. Look, there will be deep fakes. There will be misinformation. There's been misinformation in elections since we started holding elections. This is not new. And look, I've seen election interference from Russians, from Chinese, from Iranians over the years. But the reality is that I think its impact is overestimated on the American public. I find it hard to believe that there are many people in this country that are left who have not already made up their mind about supporting one candidate or the other in this November election. So I don't think that a lot of this misinformation and disinformation is actually going to land.
Let's hear from Glenn in Brooklyn, New York. He's calling on the Democrats line. Good morning, Glenn.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having the wonderful guest, and God bless C-SPAN. I have a question. Does China have a purposeful policy of flooding Mexico with raw materials to make fentanyl so that Americans destroy ourselves from within our country? Or is this just a wide conspiracy theory? Thank you so much. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a conspiracy theory. I don't know if this is an intentional policy by China to flood precursors for making chemical into our country, but they're certainly not doing a whole lot to stop it. So they're an enormous part of this problem. They manufacture most of these precursors. They have not labeled most of them as controlled substances to allow their regulation. There's some talks right now happening between the Biden administration and China to try to address it, but the fact that they haven't yet, I think, speaks volumes about their intentions.
Let's hear from Diane in DeSoto, Kansas, on the Republican line. Good morning, Diane.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I've called in to C-SPAN on the same topic about 3 times, I think, and that's with regard to the Chinese having a monopoly over control of our pharmaceutical drugs. And I'm speaking of the active ingredients that it is not something that the United States has done. We can make formulated products, end products, but they have, over the years, taken over control of the manufacture of pharmaceutical active ingredients, which were made by many big worldwide drug companies. What I'm concerned about is that in itself, if they cut off our distribution or their distribution to us, well, it would be catastrophic. I know that Donald Trump, when he was president, looked into this situation and had looked at some place in Puerto Rico or whatnot as possibly taking control of this situation. Do you know if anything has come of that, or are there any plans to it's like the chips. I mean, we need these pharmaceutical drugs, and it scares me.
Yeah, that's a great question. The U.S. House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, this bipartisan committee that was set up in the House of Representatives in this Congress, is looking at that issue very carefully. It is a big area of concern. There are the countries that can manufacture these precursors. India and South Africa in particular are big ones. We need to make sure we're working with them and try to build capacity here domestically as well to make sure that China doesn't have leverage over us. Again, for deterrence of the invasion of Taiwan and winning the broader Cold War, it is really vital that we have leverage over China and they have less leverage over us. It's in those technologies that I mentioned, but it's also in areas like pharmaceuticals.
Let's go to Jay in Bethlehem, New Hampshire on the independent line. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm curious, you speak about national security and sovereignty and concern for sovereignty of the United States, but you know, for instance, there's this huge pandemic treaty that's being shoved through rather quietly as a great, grave concern. And of course, you know, the borders being open, and you hear talk, you don't know, are these, you know, guerrilla forces coming into our country? And it seems that the technology is allowing this consolidation that's sort of well beyond the intent of our Constitution and national interest. So thank you very much.
Yeah, look, the border is actually an interesting issue because we now have not just people from Latin America coming across the border, but every month about 4,000 Chinese nationals are coming across the border. Now, many of them are probably looking for just a better way to improve their lives, and the economy in China is not doing so well right now. But you can imagine that a number of them are likely also officers of Chinese intelligence that are trying to infiltrate into this country. We've had an enormous amount of Chinese espionage, both in the economic sphere and the national security sphere over the last really 30, 40 years. And it's been only growing, both in cyber domain and in traditional espionage as well. Under the Trump administration, we closed a key consulate in Houston that was a hotbed a lot of this espionage, but it's continuing to proliferate.
And you talked a little bit about what an attack on Taiwan could look like. This from your book. Countering China also means being clear with our friends, Taiwan first and foremost among them. The message should be simple. Americans can't be expected to fight for Taiwan's freedom if Taiwan won't itself. The truth is that Taiwan historically hasn't been all that serious about its own defense. It has long fallen prey to magical thinking that the island's economic links with China will prevent a conflict. And if that fails, the big, powerful U.S. military will rush in to its rescue. Part of that strategy has been massive investments in the development of semiconductors, the so-called Silicon Shield, which rests on the idea that China will not invade Taiwan as long as it is reliant on the island's chips. The trouble with that strategy, of course, is that Taiwan itself has undermined it by assisting in the development of China's semiconductor industry, aiding the reduction of the mainland's resistance on TSMC's island fabs. And as the rising tensions show, the chips might actually be the primary reason China today covets Taiwan. Consequently, Taiwan needs to get serious about investing in its military capabilities and its fighting force, learning and incorporating the hard-won lessons of Ukraine's battle against Russia. As tiny of an island Taiwan may seem, it actually stands a good chance of repelling a Chinese invasion with the right preparation. So how does it prepare?
So it needs to invest in asymmetric capabilities. It needs to invest in massive numbers of anti-ship missiles, of mines, coastal defense batteries. It needs to prevent the Chinese fleet from being able to cross the Taiwan Strait and land in significant numbers, particularly capturing the port and the airfields on Taiwan. And the reality is that right now, Taiwan is increasing its military spending. It's over 2% of its GDP is being spent, but it's being, of course, eclipsed by the Chinese military spending by a huge number. But more importantly, they're not spending on the right things. When I was in Taiwan last year, the president announced her major military industrial project, which was the building of the first indigenous submarine. There are just two small problems with that submarine. First of all, the Taiwan Strait is too shallow to put a submarine in. It's only about 300 feet, so their concept of operation for that submarine is very murky. And two, it is built with the very best of 1960s Dutch technology, which Taiwanese were able to buy back before most countries withdrew recognition of Taiwan. So it is not something, they spent almost $2 billion building the submarine. They want to build 7 more. Those submarines will not help them in the defense of the island. They're buying M1 Abrams tanks. Taiwan is a mountainous terrain. They're not going to have tank battles like Ukraine does. So they need to make sure that they're investing in capabilities that can sink the fleet, prevent the capture of their ports and their airports, not in these very prestigious but incredibly expensive projects that may not aid to their defense.
And as you mentioned, they can't rely on the U.S. We have a lot of other global obligations. You point that out in the book. Are there other countries that could come to Taiwan's aid or support them if China were to?
Well, I think that if the U.S. did not support Taiwan, no one else will. That no one else is going to confront China without us. I think if we're in, very likely the Australians and the Japanese will be fighting alongside us. They do view Taiwan as very strategic to their interests. And with our help, they stand a chance at victory. Without our help, they will not. The Philippines may or may not. They've been moving very forcefully, particularly in recent years, to confront China. They have their own problems with China, of course, in the South China Sea. But that's a much less certain proposition.
Let's hear from Joe in Florida, calling on the independent line. Good morning, Joe.
Yes, I have a question for this gentleman, who's 44 years old, but he made a statement that he's been studying these affairs, for 50 years. Now,
15.
You can't believe a person, who's 44, and yet he says he's been studying for 50 years. Joe, you can't study unless you're born.
Joe, did you hear what he said?
It's 15, 15, not 50.
I could swear that I heard 50 on it.
You're mistaken.
I can swear.
Do you have a question for?
I read it back just to hear it again. You can play it back yourself.
Joe, do you have a question for Dmitri?
No, I just want to make sure because I'm from the news.
We'll go to Dick in Chicago, also on the independent line. Good morning, Dick.
Hello. I don't know if I'm calling on the right C-SPAN channel. I just want to give him his impression on what George Bush did in giving our companies tax breaks and taking all the jobs to China, which might be why they're so wealthy. Doing the same thing again in Indiana, giving them a tax break to keep them in Indiana, and they still moved out of the United States down to Latin America. I don't know why the Republicans think they can make America great when they're making China great. I don't know if you have a response to that.
Well, look, I think there's no question that for the last 45 years, under Democratic and Republican administrations, we have not been focused on confronting China. We've been focused on enabling them, on providing them with intellectual property. In the 1970s and 80s, we were selling them with military equipment that they've promptly reverse engineered and have helped build up their own capabilities. We only stopped that after Tiananmen Square in 1989. But of course, even in the 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, we were providing them with space technologies to help build up their aerospace sector. Under George W. Bush, we let them into the WTO. That has made them much, much richer and more powerful. So many administrations, until very recently, have been enabling China's rise, thinking that we will all benefit. And we have benefited, in fairness, economically, but we have lost a lot on the national security grounds.
The second part of your book focuses on what you call a game plan for victory. Walk us through what some of that looks like.
So it really starts with defending and deterring this invasion of Taiwan. Look, there are three outcomes, potential outcomes here. One, the Goldilocks solution is that we manage to avoid conflict. China never moves on Taiwan. We preserve the status quo. That's what we should strive for. If China does fight for Taiwan and either wins or loses, it'll be a complete disaster for the United States. First of all, a war with China is almost unimaginable, right? We have never fought a nuclear power before. The chance that that conflict stays conventional is, we don't even know what that chance might be. The fact that the chance that it would stay constrained to just that region and that our mainland United States would not get hit, I think is also fairly small, because in any scenario of a fight in the Pacific, we will probably have to strike Chinese mainland, particularly their Air Force bases and potentially naval facilities. Well, if we do that, they're going to strike us here domestically with ballistic missiles flying into the United States. Hopefully conventional, but you can't predict that. So we have to avoid this war at all costs. If China moves on Taiwan and we don't fight and they take Taiwan, it will, as I mentioned, I think will likely lead to the end of American superpower, American century. It will lead to China's resurgence and their global influence around the world. I don't necessarily believe that China will move on to occupy and invade other countries like Japan and the Philippines, as some people say. Look, I think in 1945 it would have been very, very difficult for us to invade Japan. I don't think anyone is invading Japan now. But you don't need to invade these countries to bully them around, to have enormous influence over them. Just look at what happens with Russia's neighbors, let's say in Central Asia, where they're fully within Russia's sphere of influence, not because they want to be, but because they have no choice, because they live next to a great power that, or large power, I should say, that can bully them around economically, militarily, diplomatically. And that's going to be Asia if China is able to escape that containment and take Taiwan and push the U.S. out of that region. And Asia, of course, is going to have almost 50% of the world's GDP very soon. It has most of the world's supply chains. It's an incredible platform to expand their influence, not just in that region, but globally.
Let's hear from Mark in Columbia, South Carolina on the independent line. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, everyone. And I would congratulate C-SPAN for inviting an intelligent person like Mr. Dmitri. What an outstanding conversation we are having. I mean, I have learned so much. It feels like watching Charlie Rose show that I used to watch, and unfortunately we don't have that anymore. And I just want to thank him for this wonderful book, which I am planning to read. And also I want to thank C-SPAN for inviting Mr. Boston. Excellent conversations. And I hope these two guests will come back again. And sir, you keep up the good work. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks so much.
You've said that the U.S. is already in a Cold War. with China. Two questions. Is that our best case scenario? And is there the chance that we can de-escalate from where we are right now?
Well, look, when I look at the alternatives to the Cold War, it's a hot war. So I absolutely believe that it's a much better alternative. I'd rather fight a Cold War than a hot war. But look, we know how to fight Cold Wars. We've done it before. We've won it. We have all the advantages. One of the other points in the book, and despite its title, World on the Brink, it is actually a very optimistic book because it argues that we have all the advantages. We have the world's greatest economy. It is now very clear that China will never catch up with us unless something dramatic happens. They're 25% smaller in terms of their economic power, and they've reached so-called middle income trap where other countries that have done it, where you reach about $10,000 per capita, economic growth stagnates. You've seen it in Korea, you've seen it in Japan, you've seen it in Taiwan. Well, China is now facing the same proposition before even the demographics kick in the next couple of decades. Their real growth is likely about 2.5%. About the same as ours, and they're 25% smaller. So that means that we will be the world's greatest power for the foreseeable future. We have the world's greatest military. We have the world's greatest alliances, both NATO and our alliances in Japan, with Australia, with Korea in the region, Philippines. And we have the world's greatest innovation, the world's greatest capital base. So we have all these enormous advantages. If we don't squander them, we can absolutely win this war, Cold War. We can avoid a hot war, and that's something that we should be striving for.
World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. The book is on sale now. Dmitri Alperovitch, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
That is it for today's show. We appreciate everyone who joined us for our conversation and also our guest who joined us. We will be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern and 4 a.m. Pacific. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.